Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you very much for attending this workshop entitled No Eurozone Without Euro Dividends. So the workshop was originally organized by Louise Haag from the University of York and myself. I'm Yannick van der Bort from Louvain University. But Louise, due to serious health problems, could not make it. So I will chair the session today. She could not come to Munich. And the session will be organized as follows. So Philippe Van Parijs from Louvain University and Oxford University will give his presentation on the Euro dividend issue within 20 to 25 minutes. And then we have asked three speakers to comment on his presentation and to give their own thoughts about this issue of Eurozone and Euro dividends. So the three discussants are Klaus Offe, who is a professor, retired professor of political sociology at the Hertie School of Governance, retired but still very active, I must say. Johanna Perkio is a PhD candidate student from the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Tampere in Finland, and she's working on a PhD on basic income there in Finland. And finally, Klaus Sandor from Austria. He's also very active, by the way, coordinator at Attack for Basic Income in Austria, and as many of you know, is the representative for the European Citizens Initiative. And I have to say also, for those among you who are interested in those issues,
right, so I have just two slides to show you, and the argument will essentially consist in spelling out what is already in the quote on the first slide, and then in scrapping a number of items on the second slide. So the sort of general perspective from which I'm going to speak is in fact well put in this quote from a very recent piece by Amartya Sen, professor at Harvard and Nobel laureate in economics, which says in a paper entitled What Happened to Europe, which says a unified currency in a politically united federal country, such as in the United States of America, survives through means such as substantial population movements and significant transfers that are not available to a politically disunited Europe. Sooner or later, the difficult question of the long-run viability of the euro would have to be addressed, even if the rescue plans are completely successful in preventing a breakdown of the euro in the short run. And so my central claim will simply be that this long-term viability of the euro can only be secured through the introduction of a euro dividend, that is a euro-wide universal basic income funded in a particular way. I've sketched this argument already a number of times in recent months, including with the President of the European Council, but it's the first time. I just finished the paper, and I apologize to my discussants that I only finished the paper 2 days ago, and would only send it to them then. There is no paper generally available because I still want to correct a few things in the paper, but the full paper will be available in the coming days at the address which you have there. So if we could just switch to the next slide, and that will occupy us for the next 17 minutes or so. So my argument consists in three stages. The first stage consists in supporting the claim that the Eurozone cannot be viable without transnational transfers, slightly more specific than the claim made by Sen in the quote. Two, the transnational transfers need to take the form of a euro dividend. And three, this euro dividend needs to be funded essentially by a value-added tax. These will be my three claims, and so I'll just go very quickly, very sketchily through these various stages. As I said, it will essentially consist in scrapping in each of these series of items. I'll scratch them all except for one. In each case, I'll retain the last one, the last element, after having scrapped the other three. As I mentioned in the paper, there may be some answers to each of the questions I'm going to raise that are more straightforward, more obvious, and the obvious doors, but as I mentioned in the paper, some of these doors, when you open them, you see that it's a precipice, and other doors, when you open them, you see it's just a cupboard. So once you've looked at all the doors, it's worth looking at the window, which may be the only way of getting to salvation. Okay, first claim, the Eurozone cannot be viable without transnational transfers. Here I'm essentially basing my argument on a rich literature known under the name of theory of optimal currency areas. In fact, the person who started this whole literature in 1957 was a life member of BIAN, James Mead, another Nobel laureate in economics who was a member of our venerable association for several years until he died. His daughter is still one of the driving forces beyond the Swiss basic income network, James Mead, and then James Mead did his first article in the Economic Journal, and then mainly American economists developed that literature. What does that literature say? Essentially, that it has to many implications, but one of the implications it needs to have is a justification for the conclusion, often repeated by American economists of all tendencies, from Milton Friedman, Martin Feldstein, to Krugman, to Stiglitz, namely that the dollar zone for the United States, the 50 states of the US, is perfectly viable, sustainable. It's been okay for over 200 years, whereas the Eurozone is not. Why not? Because four characteristics need to be present to a sufficient extent, or at least some of them must be present to a sufficient extent for a currency area to be viable. And these four standard characteristics, as spelled out and more fully by someone called Robert Mundell, who got the Nobel Prize for it too, are these four: homogeneity, flexibility, mobility, solidarity. And I'll quickly give you the intuition behind the argument without going into detail. And essentially, when you put various countries together in a currency area, you prevent each of the components, each of the countries, from adjusting in a smooth way when their competitiveness declines. So when things, the economic activity becomes less productive, less competitive in a country, if you have a separate currency, you just let the value of your currency devalue, and then, of course, you need to pay more for anything you import, but the cost is spread over all the population, and this happens automatically without creating a major crisis. If you have a currency area, a common currency, this is no longer possible. Okay. Nevertheless, there's not too much trouble. There's hardly any trouble if these four characteristics are sufficiently present. Homogeneity, and the argument is, of course, that these features are more present, far more present in the US than in Europe. In terms of homogeneity, that is how similar the various states are to each other in terms of their specialization and their industrial specialization. There's not that much of a difference between the US and Europe. There is a great diversity in both cases. Indeed, as soon as you have a single market, there's a tendency for each of the components to specialize and to become more different from the others. So that's not what helps the US compared to Europe. What about flexibility? In particular, the downward flexibility of wages. Because if competitiveness gets worse in your country, one way of adjusting, if you can't devalue your money, is, of course, you lower your wages so that you can remain competitive. But wages are notoriously downward sticky, and they don't fall easily for good reasons. That's the case to a large extent in the US, but of course it's even more the case in Europe because you have a stronger labor legislation, stronger trade unions, and so on, and a bigger welfare state. in each of the particular countries, so that in Europe, well, the US don't do that well in this respect, if you call it well, to have a more flexible labor market, but Europe does even worse in terms of this feature as regards the sustainability of the common currency. Mobility. There is a big difference, because and what's meant here is mobility between states. If you have high unemployment in a state because competitiveness goes down and you can't devalue, well, one way of solving the problem is letting your unemployment people go away. Well, the mobility between states of the United States is currently 7 times higher than mobility between the states, the member states of the European Union. There is a big difference. Detroit or St. Louis in the US have lost half of their population, many of these people moving to other states. Finally, for solidarity, that is meant interstate transfers. According to the estimates before the euro was introduced, the main reason why the American economists said you are crazy to introduce the euro is that the solidarity in this sense, so interstate transfers, meant that in the US, for every dollar lost in GDP in one state, it was compensated up to 40% by net transfers from other states, changes in the profile of net transfers. In Europe, in the European Union, the corresponding figure was less than 1%. There have been methodological controversies about the US figure, but essentially, and so depending on the assessment, is between 20 and 40 times more interstate redistribution in the US compared to Europe. Okay, and so in this slide, you can see why in US the dollar can be sustainable, not and the euro far less. What can be done about it? Homogeneity, there is little to do about it if you keep the single market. Flexibility means slashing in your welfare states. This is not exactly what we in Europe would like to happen. It's because this is forced to happen now that we feel something needs to be done to prevent it. Mobility, it can be increased somewhat in Europe, but there is of course a very big difference between Europe and the United States, which is linguistic diversity. And so therefore, both the reluctance to move to another state will be higher in Europe, sort of structurally, and also the cost of integration in Europe when people move to another country will also be larger. So what remains? Solidarity, and so that's my first claim. If, given that the other options are not really open to us, what we need to do in order to secure the viability of the euro is increase massively interstate transfers. This leads me to the second claim, which is what form should it take? First idea would be, well, let's do like the United States, but we'll never have, and for good reasons, a mega EU-wide welfare state. Just state that without argument, we can return to that in Europe. I don't believe it is feasible, nor do I believe it is desirable. What else is possible? Some economists have proposed, well, we could have insurance schemes at the level of the states, where the state budgets of some states will just be, part of it will be transferred to other states depending on the fluctuation. There need to be no ex-ante redistribution, just a pure insurance scheme. If you do that, however nice it may look to the economists, it will lead to situations in which a poor country will have to redistribute part of its budget, despite the high debt and all the rest, to the budget of a richer country, because what you insure against is the fluctuations, not the initial situation of inequality. It's a non-starter. If you, as soon as the amounts are huge, this will collapse on the first occurrence of this sort of anomaly, which is quite likely, given that it's a pure insurance scheme. You can have something like German Finanzausgleich between the states. Here the problem that arises is that if you have a significant redistribution, you take again here out of solidarity from one, and not pure insurance from the budget of one state, member state of the EU, you give it to another. You have constant tensions of the sort you are already perceiving very clearly in the current context, whereby the countries where the money is being taken from their budget, they'll feel they have the right to meddle in the way in which the money is being used in the other country, and of course there will be hundreds, thousands of ways in which they think that the money is not properly used. So, moreover, you have to take into account the Finanzausgleich in Germany or in other federal countries is only a small fraction of the interstate redistribution. So the bulk of the redistribution in Germany, and what made the Mark, the Deutsche Mark, viable, was of course the very strong social security system, the very strong welfare state, and not the Finanzausgleich that helped fund the budgets of the poor lender. And so that leads then to the idea that it's at the level of interpersonal redistribution that something needs to happen at the European level. What form could it take? Are we back then to the mega welfare state? I claim that we are not, because you can also leave all the complex welfare states, the healthcare system, the pension system, etc., and also public assistance aspects also untouched, but you just have a simple scheme underneath, as it were. There has been one proposal along these lines by Philipp Schmitter and Michael Bauer called the Euro Stipendium, which is means testing, which is targeted at the poor. It's a European-wide budget, but its focus, it's a redistribution to households below a certain threshold. For various reasons, which Yannick and I developed in a critical article on Schmitter and discussion with Schmitter and Bauer about 10 years ago, we believe there is a deep perversity in any scheme of this sort, and that therefore the only viable and sustainable sort of interpersonal redistribution at the European level must be of a universal sort, where you give an income you transfer an income universally to every citizen, or if there is a differentiation, it can be an age differentiation. We can say it's universal but only to the children, or universal but only to people above a certain age. There can also conceivably, and don't discuss it in the paper, be a differentiation in terms of the purchasing power in the various countries. So the level of the transfer could be conceivably different. Of course, and the more you take that into account, the less redistribution there will be between countries. But it is also what follows from my argument doesn't exclude that possibility. Anyway, that's what I call a Euro dividend, and so EU-wide, and so the funding must be at the level of the EU, and the distribution must be universal. The funding, then, essential element, and that's my third thesis, that this Euro dividend can only be, to have at least a level that is minimally significant, can only be funded essentially by a value-added tax. Why? I exclude the two main sources of revenues at the national level, namely personal income tax and social security contribution, the main source in addition to VAT, to which I return. I exclude personal income tax because trying to have a EU-wide personal income tax would be extremely contentious, extremely laborious, because taxable income is defined in different ways in different countries, and this is an extremely sensitive issue politically. And so, whether how you take into account the reimbursement for for your housing, how you take the composition of the household into account, all these things, as you know, are complex in each country and extremely touchy politically. Trying to unify it is a lost battle. Social security contributions is a significant amount of money too, but of course the logic of these social security contributions is the workers paying into a social insurance schemes in order to get some indirect wage in the form of an insurance premium for old age, etc. So the logic of it is really not to use that for a universal benefit, but to keep it as the sort of conditional social insurance benefit that is paid in this particular way. So what's then left? You may think then about two things that are often mentioned now recent contexts. One is the financial transaction tax, this so-called Tobin tax. Okay, there is, of course, in this case, very strong reason to organize that at the European level rather than, or even at the global level, certainly at the EU level, rather than at the level of particular countries. But even with the very optimistic estimates, of course, how much the yield will be is crucially dependent on many details of the taxation scheme, because it's so easy to evade it in various ways, because it's also fluctuating considerably with speculative movements. So at most, what you can get out of a tax of this sort would be a basic income of 10 euros per month and per European citizen, 10 euros, okay? If you turn that to a carbon tax, with Yannick's help, I've been trying to get some figure, some maximal figure that would be got in this way. The maximal figure should correspond to what you would be able to collect if you got the whole of all the carbon emission permits that are allocated to the European Union and just sold them to the highest bidder. You don't give anything free, you sell them on a free market, and let people, that is businesses, all the polluters, the carbon emitters, bid for it at the highest level. You collect all this money, and then you distribute it equally between all European residents. Here again, it makes sense certainly to organize it at the European level, but the yield on the fairly optimistic assumptions to be verified will be in the order of 10 or 12 euros, no more. Okay? So you have two sources of income that would be very bulky, but don't make much sense at the European level. Two sources of income that do make a lot of sense at the European level, but would only yield, even together, basic income euro dividend of not more than 20 euros per capita. Is there anything else? Yes, there is something else, which is the most Europeanized of all forms of taxation so far, namely VAT. At the moment, there is 0.3% of a very tiny amount, 0.3% of the VAT that is used by the European Union, and that goes into the budget. It's not the main source of the small European budget, but it's already, there is already a so-called harmonized value-added tax base, which could be used for this purpose. And if you do that, and you introduce a VAT at 20%, then what you get is basic income, a euro dividend of 200 euros, about 200 euros per month. Okay? These are the figures. I'm not proposing that as a sort of fully polished proposal, but this is a baseline for serious thinking about this sort of issue. Of course, if you wanted to differentiate that from country to country, there are countries where the purchasing power is much higher than in others, and you could have a higher your dividend in Germany, for example, because the cost of living is higher in Germany than in some other countries. You could differentiate in that way. You could, of course, if you focus on one particular age category, you get to higher amounts. But if you want to have a really universal basic income for the whole population, this is the sort of amount you get to. Of course, and I won't go into that now, but I discussed that at the end of the paper, and it's important to see that this will not leave all the rest of the tax system of each country unchanged. There are lots of adjustments, or significant adjustments to be made, both as regards the personal income tax, because here every individual will receive a basic amount at the bottom of whatever income he or she receives from all the sources. And of course, a major readjustment each country could do would be precisely by lowering the level of their own VAT, so that the total level of VAT raised would not simply go up by another 20%, given that in some countries, for most goods, it's already 21% or so, and so having a 40% rate of VAT may be regarded certainly as excessive if you want to jump to it in one go. But this is not what we would be talking about, given the adjustment that will be made in various ways in the tax and transfer system of each country. at the end of the paper I also discussed briefly the political feasibility, but I won't go into that now. And so this is essentially my argument, and so I repeat that it's an argument by elimination. I mean what Sen says and what the American economists have been telling us from the 1990s, saying, well, this may make a lot of political sense for you Europeans, but economically it's an absolute stupidity what you are doing. It doesn't make any sense because you don't have the background conditions. And some of the European leaders say, in fact, the same today by saying, well, we've inherited the euro, but the euro was introduced without these background conditions, so we are stuck here with the problems. And at the time we told the Americans just mind your own business. We want to have a euro. It's not for you to tell us what we want to do. We saw, of course, that the Americans, it was not in the interest of the Americans to have another big currency that would compete with the dollar as a major reserve currency. So we said these people are self-interested. They don't want us to have the euro in order not to compete with them. But they had a point. And, but the point they had must not make us go back. It must make us move forward and create the conditions which, of the sort, I believe we need. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip, for having respect to the time limit, for also having prepared this new paper, very stimulating paper for this workshop. And now we can turn to the discussion. So thanks again to the three of you for having accepted to be part of the panel. Each of you have like 10 minutes to comment on the paper, to bring your own thinking about this issue, and then we will take questions from the floor. Okay? I'm going to ask to Klaus Offe to bring his comments. Klaus, the floor is yours.
So I strongly recommend that you read Philippe's paper once it becomes available in the full version. It is a rich and original paper with this elegant methodology of subtraction. You know, he counts what does not work and then focuses on what may work. The assumption is that the euro is, according to what the American economists of all stripes and shapes told us, the euro is nonsense from the beginning. We are stuck with it. The assumption at the beginning of the euro were that the heterogeneity of the Eurozone will be overcome through a variety of instruments. One is competition in the free market and the four market freedoms. The second is the approximation of the unit cost of labor in European countries through structural funds and other means by which the less competitive countries would eventually then become more competitive, so that we arrive at a level playing field in due time. And another mistake was of the Eurozone and its design, that the Maastricht criteria had a sanctioning mechanism attached to this, which did not turn out to work. And one digression here, if this was a mistake, there are also beneficiaries of the mistake and people who suffer from having made that mistake. And it's pretty clear who are the beneficiaries. Germany, Finland, the Netherlands, Estonia, Luxembourg are the beneficiaries, and the rest are the losers. And one could argue in the present discussion on the euro that the beneficiaries of a mistake being collectively made in the past should pay according to the benefits they derive from it. And that is what is actually going to happen without anyone telling the Germans or anyone else among the winners of this game that this is going to happen. And it is urgently required that someone tells them and acts accordingly. But that is not our topic here. The wider euro crisis and debt crisis. There are the four criteria: homogeneity, flexibility, mobility, which is, this is one of Philippe's favorite problems, strongly limited by the 23 or 22 languages, official languages. You simply cannot move to another country and get the same level of job and pay without speaking the local language, which has enormous transaction costs, which are typically absent in the case of the United States. So what remains is solidarity, to unify the divergent Eurozone and make it viable, what has not happened in the past. And it is interesting to see that the debate is often starting these days from the assumption that the United States are ahead. They are the beneficiaries of an arrangement that the Europeans cannot hope to strive for, namely unilingual or bilingual, but not country by country or state by state bilingual, I mean, American English plus Spanish. That is what they speak, and there is a class component to this. The United States are ahead. They are a model of how. Also by the fact that most European places, for a long time I wondered why this is the case, social assistance and income maintenance is a local affair. In the United States it is a federal affair. And that does a lot to institutionalize interstate solidarity, which is not present and has not been created by the open method of coordination in the European case. That has not been very effective. So what can Europeans do? It's also worth considering, apart from language, the fact that uneven distribution of unemployment and poverty within countries do not automatically self-correct, because if you are unemployment, for instance, in the far northwest of Germany, where they have an average unemployment of 25%, Arbeitsamt Aurich, people from there do not move to Stuttgart, where they could find employment, because they have their local networks, they have their property there, and they know how to get along with local circumstances, and they do not move. This is a simplistic economist's assumption that people move to the place where they find the best employment opportunities. But this is just an aside. What we see in Europe, and as a dominant European philosophy, is the following: if you cannot devalue your currency, you devalue your labor. And that is what is happening to Greece, and this is a downward spiral of the most disastrous consequences. Now, let's come to the remedies of this situation. What Philippe tells us, and I think this is a very encouraging message, is we need transnational interpersonal redistribution. How can that, in order to secure an income floor in the countries that are the losers of the Euro game? And the sources of that are two that he discusses: the Tobin tax, three actually: the carbon tax and the value-added tax. I would ask the question, why not a megabyte tax, which is a insufficiently addressed sources of redistribution. If megabytes are in their commercial use, the major job killers of technological unemployment, then the users of these megabytes should pay for it in a very limited amount. But I mean, you can. I do not have the calculation as you are, but that I think is an option that should be taken into consideration. My major problem is that the European Union does not have a taxing authority. And how do you endow the European Union with a taxing authority in the political context that we presently live through? In particular, if it is a progressive taxing authority by country. The rich pay a higher percentage in value than the poor. That would be the redistributive, both among countries and among persons. I would add to this that we should explore the possibility of having a progressive value-added tax. That is a new upcoming idea. It's not my idea, but I follow it with great interest. The idea is the following. Any person earning income reports to the Internal Revenue Service of the country in question two things. One, how much he or she earned last year, and second, how much of these earnings go into investment or savings. Then a simple subtraction says that the difference between the two, the difference between the two is consumption. I mean, savings and consumption, right? Income is savings and consumption. So the higher the consumption, the higher the percentage of value-added tax you pay at the end of the year on that consumption. That compensates for the basically regressive nature of value-added taxes, right? And I think this is an idea that could be included. But the main institutional point is that the EU does not have a direct taxing authority. And in order to introduce that, you would have to change the treaty in a way that would meet with major, bitter, fierce political opposition within member states. If you explore the idea of a progressive, not among countries, but among persons, value-added tax, the resources would be available to fund the idea of putting a floor underneath the income of all European citizens. Thank you.
So now we are going to listen to Joanna Perkiö she's from Finland, so if we believe Klaus, you're from one of the winners of the mistakes that have been done. But as you know, in Finland, Euroscepticism is growing, so listen to you. Thank you.
I first want to thank Philip van Parijs for this inspiring paper and also the organizers for invitation. It's a great privilege to be here. I find this proposal of Euro dividend, for example, 2,000 euros funded primarily by value-added tax, very interesting and fascinating in many ways. The proposal is formulated in a pragmatic and appealing way, and it sounds also quite feasible considering the current economic and political situation. Already a wider public discussion on this alternative would help to break down the nationalistic and egoistic attitudes that are so widespread today and be a step toward wider solidarity that exceeds the national borders. On the other hand, it would also require a large shift in the political climate. In the context of global economic turmoil and the euro crisis, the prevailing economic paradigm ought to be strongly contested and the new progressive alternatives need to be brought on the table. A universal basic income is one of the most promising concrete proposals which could open up pathways toward a more egalitarian and sustainable society. And therefore it's extremely important that in addition to moral justification, powerful economic arguments in favor of basic income will be brought in. Van Parijs' proposal greatly serves that purpose. It proves well that the euro dividend would be both morally fair and economically reasonable. However, what would be extremely important, at least in the longer term, is to build economic justification for basic income on the theories that contest the neoliberal paradigm. This paper is not doing that, perhaps for pragmatic reasons, which might be a good short-term political strategy. Modern economic calculations which prove the feasibility of basic income within the neoliberal paradigm, we need a strong theoretical foundation that is contesting the assumptions and self-evidences of that paradigm. In the neo-Keynesian tradition, one can find perhaps the most promising approaches, for example, the theory of functional finance, in which the public spending is managed by central bank and the taxation and budget balancing do not play such a central role as today. The euro dividend would be urgently needed emergency aid for the citizens of those European countries who have almost no welfare state at all, or which have radically cutting down their welfare programs, countries like Greece or Spain. It would also level down the inequalities between those who live in generous welfare states and those whose countries have serious shortages, especially in the minimum social security schemes. The euro dividend could well function as a part of the solution for the series of problems of the eurozone. In addition, considerable reforms are needed in the financial sector, in the mandate of the European Central Bank, and in unification in the capital and wage income taxation in European countries in order to tackle tax avoidance. However, what I'm wondering is whether the euro dividend would encourage countries to implement their own national basic income schemes, or whether it, in the first case, would give them incentives to increasingly cut down their existing welfare programs. This might not be a problem with the insurance-based schemes, but the basic social security, which is funded by taxation, would be in danger. Another thing is that as a flat rate tax, the value-added tax is nevertheless not unproblematic, and detailed calculations would be needed on its effects on different kinds of low-income groups in different regions, as well as on employment and especially the small enterprises. These questions are not addressed in the paper. The welfare states have been national creations, and it has proved difficult to extend the economic rights beyond national borders, since the proper institutions and transnational solidarity are missing. Van Parijs' innovative and viable proposal for euro dividend could be an important step toward extension of social and economic rights, and in the best case it would pave the way towards global solidarity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have the last discussing, Klaus Sandor from Austria. So you also have 10 minutes, and then Philip will reply and we'll go to the audience, okay? The floor is yours. Do you want to set up?
Ja, also ich möchte ein bisschen ausholen und dann konkret auf den Punkt 3 eingehen, der hier auf dem Film, also auf dem Video zu sehen ist. Wir haben 2008, da sage ich wir, in dem Fall Sepp Kustascher, ein ehemaliger EU-Parlamentarier, und ich habe zusammen einen Vorschlag ausgearbeitet, wie man die Sozialpolitik in Europa verbessern könnte. Und da war eben eine Vorstellung, dass man sagt, wir teilen die Kompetenzen zwischen den Nationalstaaten, die derzeit das Hauptgewicht für die Sozialpolitik haben, und der EU-Kommission, also der EU-Ebene. Und geben der EU-Ebene sozusagen das Recht, eine Direktive herauszugeben, dass das bedingungslose Grundeinkommen in Europa als Kriterien, wie sie formuliert sind, bei allen Member States sozusagen als Grundlage Zielvorstellungen sein sollen. Und jedes Member State die Aufgabe hat, ihr national gewachsenes, historisch gewachsenes Sozialsystem entsprechend diesen Regeln im Laufe der Zeit anzupassen. Und da war natürlich genau der eine Punkt, dass wir ganz ungleiche Verhältnisse in den europäischen Staaten haben. Und unser Vorschlag war in dem Fall, dass wir sagen, ohne es zu konkretisieren in Ziffern und Berechnungen, dass wir sagen, wir können dieses Korridormodell, das hatten wir von Klaus Busch gesehen, einrichten für die Sozialpolitik. Und zwar, das ist so etwas Ähnliches wie die Maastricht-Kriterien für die Finanzwelt, wo ein bestimmter Level mit Abweichungen möglich war, wäre da gewesen eine bestimmte Vorgabe für die Ausgaben der Sozialpolitik in jedem Member State, abhängig von ihrem Bruttoinlandsprodukt. Und da könnte man 5 Zonen zum Beispiel bei den damals 25 Mitgliedstaaten eruieren, wo man also ungefähr gleich starke hineinstellt. Und von den Reichen zu den Ärmeren wird eine Solidaritätssteuer eingehoben, die entsprechend im Laufe der Zeit die Angleichung innerhalb der Länder erreichen sollte. Und von dieser Maßnahme ausgehend hätten wir gemeint, kann dann die Finanzierung des bedingungslosen Grundeinkommens jedem Nationalstaat überlassen bleiben, in welcher Methode er finanziert. Und wir hatten also keine diese ähnliche Vorgehensweise gewählt, sondern eben nur eine staatliche Angleichung der Grundlagen, und dann macht das jeder Nationalstaat für sich. Und diese Methode wäre ein Weg. Umgekehrt gefällt mir natürlich diese Idee sehr gut, die jetzt Philipp präsentiert hat, dass man sagt, eigentlich sollte Europa seine Sozialstaatgedanken einfach sozusagen zum Ausdruck bringen, indem man sagt, also jedem Bürger wird eben ein bestimmter Anteil eines sogenannten Unconditional Basic Income gezahlt, aber eben nicht in dem Fall in der vollen Höhe, sondern eben in einem Art Sockelbetrag, und dann bleibt dann wieder jedem Nationalstaat die zusätzliche Finanzierung, um das Kriterium high enough sozusagen zu erreichen, zu finanzieren. Also es wäre sozusagen in meinen Augen ein guter Impuls, dass man sagt, man nimmt die soziale Union ernst, dass man also nicht nur die Banken rettet mit Milliardenbeträgen, sondern dass man auch hier in dem Fall konkret für die Bürger, jeden einzelnen Bürger, sofort etwas tut und das bezahlt. Und da erscheint mir nur, und das ist meine Hauptkritik an dieser Vorstellung, dass 200 € ein zu kleiner Sockel sind. Und die Finanzierung des Sockelbetrages ist in diesen Berechnungen eine mögliche Vorausrechnung, aber genau der Punkt, dass man die ersten beiden, also Personal Income Tax und Social Security Contributions, hier in dem Vorschlag sagt, das ist so kompliziert und national unterschiedlich, daher kann man das jetzt gar nicht europaweit angehen. Da haben wir also in Österreich zum Beispiel jetzt gerade eine Idee, wir wollen eine integrierte Steuer einführen, die sich zusammensetzt aus dem Personal Income Tax und Social Security Contributions, die sozusagen in einen Topf gegeben werden, und von dort wird dann eine progressive Steuerpolitik, die selbstverständlich eine Umverteilung von oben nach unten mit enthält, herangezogen, um genügend Geld zu bekommen für die Finanzierung des bedingungslosen Grundeinkommens. Und so etwas Ähnliches könnte man auch europaweit machen. Warum ist die Steuerpolitik in Europa so unterschiedlich? Eigentlich sollte es eine Voraussetzung sein für einen gemeinsamen Markt, dass die Steuerpolitik angeglichen wird. Und das ist ja auch schon eine lange Forderung, dass so etwas geschieht. Und insofern hätte ich da viel Sympathie dafür, das zu tun. Und dann kann der Betrag 200 deutlich erhöht werden, gleich von Anfang an. Und die anderen Sachen bin ich voll dafür, dass man eine Transaktionssteuer einführt. Das ist ja eine der ATTAC-Positionen schon seit 10 Jahren, ja? Dass man die endlich Wirklichkeit macht. Nur, auch hier bin ich nicht einverstanden mit dem geringen Betrag. Wer sagt, dass das nur 0,01 oder 0,1% sein soll? Warum nicht 2%? Man kann dort jeden beliebigen Betrag herausreklamieren. Die Spekulation wird komplett unterbunden. Also warum nicht stark eindämmen? Und dann hat man sofort mehr. Und das andere, Carbon Tax, ist natürlich eine ökologisch angesetzte Idee. Voll dafür, weil das müssten wir ja was tun und das ist super, wenn man das jetzt hier einsetzt. Bei der Value-Added Tax ist es auch so, dass wir diese Massensteuer sozusagen zunächst einmal politisch immer möglichst keine Massensteuererhöhung, weil dann sind die Armen besonders betroffen und so. Das muss ja nicht sein. Unsere Vorstellung ist, dass diese Massensteuer für Dinge des täglichen Gebrauchs, wir haben in Österreich 10 und 20%, von 10% auf 5% reduziert wird und für alles andere 50% erhöht wird. Und sofort haben wir mehr als heute in dieser Value-Added Tax. Das heißt, das kann ja jeder machen, das können wir auch europaweit machen. Warum könnte man diesen Weg nicht eingehen? Danke.
Entschuldigung, nur das letzte habe ich nicht gut verstanden, so über die...
Also in Österreich heißt das Umsatzsteuer und ich nehme an, das ist gemeint. Ja? Und in Österreich haben wir 2 Steuersätze, 10% oder 20%. Und wir wollten jetzt 2 neue einführen, die eine reduzieren auf 5% für die Dinge, dann haben sogar die Leute, die wenig hatten, sogar einen Vorteil durch die Änderung dieser Umsatzsteuer und alles andere wird einfach teurer. Und das ist auch ein ökologischer Ansatz. Wir brauchen Luxusgüter nicht. Wir sollen eigentlich simplify your life und so weiter und so weiter. Neuer Lebensstil und so.
To reply, so that's about 20 seconds per question, I think. So I'll be very selective and a bit telegraphic, perhaps starting at the end. Yes, well, I have no principled objection against using other taxes, in particular the personal income tax. If we could do that, it has many advantages over the VAT. But you must know, each of you must know, from the national debates on these things, how even changing the way in which interests on home ownership are being taken into account in the tax base, how that can lead to years and years of heavy debates in the country for a small change in the tax law. And so having something, so an integrated tax of the sort you suggested at European level, I'm all for it, but this will be for another century, and the problems are more urgent. Then similarly, for a number of the other things you say, the Tobin tax, you say, well, why such a tiny percentage? It's simply because if you taxed even just double this 0 point thing, the tax base would just disappear. If you tax speculation, speculation only happens, all these transfers, because precisely they're not taxed. And so that, and you are very quickly in the so-called prohibited range of the tax rate, so that in order to maximize the yield, it's not like the income tax or VAT. You can't, if you have a 20% tax, nothing is left, you have nothing to tax. So it's very important and not to take reality into account and not dream about tax yield, which will never come. And so my point about also giving some figures, and that can be qualified, there rest on all sorts of assumptions, but we must not dream. The Tobin tax will never, Tobin himself, I had the wrong conversation on basic income with Tobin 10 years ago or so, And he said that Tobin tax will never be able to fund anything. It will stabilize the capitalist economy. It will help it function better. That is what it's meant for, where it's never going to yield a lot of income. And even this 10 euros per head is very optimistic in my view. It's an assessment by the European Commission. Anyway, so that on your more fundamental difference in the approach, I mean, I welcome also all the other things that are being done, including saying, well, we should aim to have some sort of decent minimum achieved in each country, have an indicator of how well this is achieved, have some open method of coordination in order to assess that, have some directives that impose that on countries in a more, in a stronger way. But all this would not, as long as it's funded at the national level, will not address the problem I'm trying to address here. And this is really about stabilizing the Eurozone and making it something sustainable. And of course, as long as you keep the welfare states entirely funded at the national level, it doesn't help. It may improve, and there are worthwhile efforts, and I strongly believe, of course, that we, basic income supporters, should also fight for much higher levels of basic income at the national level. But this is the sort of realistic proposal we can make on the European level. To Johan, so perhaps just two things. I'm all for theoretical challenges, alternatives to common economic thinking about all that, but it needs to be specified. Just saying, well, we need a Keynesian alternative to all this. Well, Keynesian alternative will tell you, well, I mean, there's nothing that bad about some deficits, about inflation. We can also, in a sort of quasi-Keynesian perspective, you may also think about another way of funding, which is simply monetary creation. And again, it's not total nonsense. It cannot be dismissed as sort of monetary pipe dreams. But it will again, if you, the highest feasible level you can fund in this way would be something like 1% of GDP. And again, you'll get to a level far lower than these 200 euros. It may be a small contribution in the way in which a Tobin tax can be a small contribution, and it will need to fluctuate with the rate of real growth. And so I'm all in favor of alternative thinking, alternative theoretical framework, but that must be specified, and we must see really what difference that will make in terms of the policies that will make sense in order to make things better for the current generation and later generations. On VAT, well, it's true, VAT is regressive at the individual level. It can easily be made progressive, and I'm then moving on to Klaus's question, on if you progressive at the nation level, at the level of each country, because you can say it's funded by VAT, which is regressive at the individual level, but the rate of VAT that is Europeanized in each country will be greater. It will be higher in richer countries than in poorer countries. Cross question or remarks quickly. First, I fully agree with what you said at the level of the diagnosis about migration. And so it's striking that in the US, I mentioned before, the interstate migration is 7 times higher than Europe. But migration, in general, changing your domicile in general, is 3 times higher wherever you move in the US than in Europe, which means that there is I mean, one aspect of that must be what you mentioned, this reliance on local networks, etc., which plays a role, of course, in the US too, but may play, for deep reasons, a greater role in Europe. On you to suggest the megabyte tax, yes, why not? Just as I think it would make sense to think seriously about the sort of electronic transfer tax, sort of super Tobin on any time you make an electronic payment, it makes sense to think of that. But in the case of the byte tax, I think also the maximum feasible level will give you a little complement in the form of the Tobin tax. That would be my conjecture, but it's worth exploring it more, and it's certainly something that may make sense in itself. As regards your progressive consumption tax, my reason for being skeptical about it is that it's not a VAT, but it requires an assessment of income. And so we are back, and we are back to the difficulties of the personal income tax. And that would be my, and because you need an assessment of the taxation. If that's feasible, then the personal income tax is feasible too, and we may want to consider. Finally, on the industrial political feasibility, and you say absolutely rightly, we need a change of the treaty there. Yes, we need a change of the treaty, but that's the sort of tectonic change we need in the way in which Europe is organized. Of course, when you national taxation, and also needed to be organized through long struggles at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of state building, etc. We had all the local privileges you had, and slowly you managed to convince people that it was essential to have some sort of common taxation system. So that's related to what I say at the end of the paper. And so the basic challenge, and that's why organizations like BIAN and many others are so important, the national welfare states didn't drop out of the clever brains of some philosophers or out of the drawers of some bureaucrats. They were the results of struggles. And these struggles are not possible if you don't coordinate, if you don't mobilize across borders. And of course we have a far too weak pan-European civil society. The trade unions collaborate to some extent, but we don't have anything like what you had at the level of the national level. So it needs a change of the treaty and many things. So we need to help to make it politically feasible. There is still a long way to go, but we need to. It will never be politically feasible if we don't think about it in a fairly precise way. So we'll try to do it.
I am Jan Otto Andersson from Finland, and I would thank Philip for a very clear and convincing presentation. I think you find something which really will go into the discussion over the euro. One thing I must say, coming from Finland, where our neighbors are now Estonia is, but Sweden has not been member of the euro, and the Swedish krona has fluctuated in a way that you could say that Finland has perhaps not been disadvantaged by the euro that much, but Sweden has been able to have a policy which is more Keynesian, or what you could say, and because sometimes the krona has gone down quite a lot. Now we are in a situation where the euro is going down. But I think that we need this solidarity for the whole union, not only for the Eurozone. If this were to be implemented only on the Eurozone area, there would be a consequence that rich countries like Sweden and Denmark, they would say, no, never, we will not come into this. Whereas there would be an incentive for the poor EU members to say, well, we must come into the euro, and then they do anything to do that. So, at least for Finland, in the Finnish case, I would go for an EU solution here. And you could use the same arguments to a large extent, because when we have a common market for everything, then there is the idea to have a euro dividend.
Thank you. Yep.
Can I have my question? It's a different question, but it was for me it was a nice feeling to see that the conclusions you made, Phil, in your paper. It's the same as my conclusions are in my paper, but my paper starts from quite another point. It's not the currency that is the problem. I think the currency, and I say it with Götz Werner, the currency is a side phenomenon. It's not a real problem of our economic crisis. The real problem of our economic crisis is according to my analysis, it's the enormous difference in labor cost not over Europe, but also over the whole world. And then I would ask you to think about a basic income that is according to the welfare level of the local community, let's say in the Netherlands, perhaps 3 regions, let's say in Germany, perhaps 20 or 30 regions, but according to the regional economy, a basic income, and then you come to the conclusion that the basic income then will work at the same way as the currency levels from before the euro works. You can devaluate and revaluate your basic income and make, by revaluating and devaluating your basic income, you can make the same movement as we had in the currency, in the exchange rates before the euro exists. That's a thought experiment. My paper is about 7,000 words, so I cannot explore the whole thing. But my basic point is making a basic income on a regional level will work more flexible even than before the exchange rates.
Thank you. Can you pass the mic to Sean?
Sean Healy from Social Justice Ireland in Ireland. Philippe, thank you for the paper. I think it's excellent. I find it, a couple of comments maybe for suggestions, but I find it simple and elegant, really. It communicates very easily. It's not difficult for people to understand, which I think is very important if you're trying to do something across the whole of the European, the Eurozone area, and I think it meets that. I find the argument compelling, and I find it very timely because of the pressures on budgets and austerity and so on. And most importantly, I think it's possible. Now, I have one major concern, which Ofi has raised already, which is the issue, and I think maybe others as well, which is the issue that value-added tax is a regressive tax. And in Ireland, for example, the bottom 10%, the poorest 10% of the population spend more than 20% of their income paying VAT. If they don't spend 20% on items that are VAT registered, they spend more than 20% of their actual income on VAT. However, I still think that is a reality. If this were to be implemented, the VAT rate in Ireland at the moment is 23%. So I can see how it might be progressed within that level of euro dividend. Now, there are 2 big impacts, I think, that make this, for me, quite attractive. One would be that it would promote basic income across the Eurozone and reduce some of the resistance, some of the nonsensical resistance to the idea that comes from people who haven't thought about it. There are some people who are very strongly against it because they've thought it through. There's an enormous amount, though, much greater resistance, it seems to me, coming from people who have not thought about it. This would actually open a discussion that I think would be well worth doing. It would put this kind of level into place. Now it is low, and this point has been made already, but then that's the second impact that I see coming. It would actually help those of us who have been working on producing full basic income systems and costings and processes within countries, because you are not blocking that. For example, in the previous session, just finished, the 3 of us here presented a paper on Ireland with a fully costed basic income at €188 a week for the working age, more for this for children and more for older people. But we showed exactly how it can be paid for and the impacts and the various other items that will change, and the paper is on the website, on this conference's website. Now, the point I'd make is this then would be a contribution towards that. It would be €200 a month, and the balance would be done from other sources within Ireland. And it would have no overall negative impact, but it would have a big positive impact in pushing the sort of value of this, reducing the prejudice and the resistance, and opening, I think, a lot of discussion that would open a lot of minds that I think might lead us towards some kind of positive resolution to the kind of situation that the Eurozone, the dire situation that the Eurozone is in at the moment. If there was one final thing, Klaus Hoffe's idea of a progressive VAT proposal fascinates me. I look forward to reading something or wherever you have this written up. I know it's not possible to talk about it here, but I would be very interested in a progressive VAT system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this very positive comment. So perhaps again.
Yeah,
oh,
it's Mike Gerwig,
yeah.
University Paderborn, University of Paderborn, Germany. I like all the presentations. One short question. Under the illusion that the world is becoming a global village, and a kind of thinking outside of the box exercise, I was wondering, after all of your presentations, if the panel has an opinion, if thinking outside of the box, that is outside of Europe, if the possibility of a transatlantic currency zone would be a possible way to world global stability. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Very briefly, one reply to one of Philippe's objections. For this idea of a progressive value-added tax, could we take the national definition of what income is, whatever it may be, and whatever tax exemptions are deducted from income, and operate on that basis in order to make a determined difference between income and investment, which is consumption, and then tax consumption progressively. One problem in that is, of course, that tax authorities or national governments could engage into a subversive Spielhammerland effect. Namely, if the Europeans pay, we can reduce taxes, and that will then have a zero net effect, right? Let some of the taxes be paid, or some of the social security or social transfer payments be paid by Europe instead of nation state. And a question that came up in various comments is the possibilities of tax harmonization across Europe. We would have to keep the difference according to GDP in countries, but why not put a floor underneath the income taxation, including corporate income taxation? The present situation is that the marginal income tax for corporations on corporations is 58% in Denmark and 10% flat rate in Bulgaria. Right? And that is an unsustainable condition. Isn't that the first step that we should take, that we define a minimum of income taxation across the European Union, which I think is demanding, but within the range of political feasibility.
Starting from the end, then, because it's also related to Klaus's initial remarks. And so, in Europe, even if we didn't have the currency, the common currency for some of the countries, but we do have since we do have the single market and the so-called four freedoms, freedom of movement of capitals, goods, services, and people, given that we have that, there is a constant pressure on our redistributive systems. Because the more generous redistributive countries, the more generous countries in redistributive terms will tend to attract selectively more people who will be net beneficiaries, and the people who are net contributors may, if not move themselves, pretend they move away, as we've had all week now, all this fuss about the richest man in France wanting to be naturalized Belgian in order to escape allegedly, in order to
escape French taxation. So we have this pressure on our national redistributive schemes. And so we have that anyway. There's something that needs to be done. But there are two things that can be done in order to fight that challenge. One is to have harmonization along the line which Klaus suggests, so have minimum rates of taxation on the various tax bases, have some sort of, also what Klaus also suggested, some sort of Gini coefficient target, or there may be other ways. I mean, there may be a number of problems with some of these proposals, but this would go in that direction. Open method of coordination with an indicator of a social policy indicator rather than just GDP indicators and all that. All this goes into that direction. And the other strategy consists in saying part of the redistribution must happen at a higher level, because the higher the level, the higher the scale, the less vulnerable you are to opportunistic mobility, and be of the tax base, but also of the net beneficiaries. Okay? But so you have that problem anyway. But here, and there is a specific challenge that became very acute now in the last couple of years for the Eurozone because of this common currency. And that is because all the pressure, in the absence of doing anything in terms of mobility or solidarity, all the pressure is on flexibility. And so you have all these countries that are forced now to run down their welfare states in order to cope. There is the financial crisis, but there are many other triggers, like the big reform of the German welfare state under Schröder, the Hartz IV, so-called Hartz IV. So all this puts pressure on competitiveness within currency union, and therefore, if you can't rely on transfers, all the adjustment must come through flexibility, and that really is a way of dismantling very quickly our welfare states and all these achievements. So there is the general challenge that comes from the existence of the single market, and in addition, there is the challenge for the Eurozone. But whereas in the case of the first challenge, you have two strategies. For the second challenge, you need redistribution at a higher level. There, the targets within each country and so on are not a solution. You need redistribution across borders. Then I don't really believe in basic income that would fluctuate down when things go badly in a country. The whole point of the redistribution, including in the US, is on the contrary to buffer the impact on the countries that are affected by a downward movement. So I'll read your paper in order to understand fully what the argument is, but at first sight, I really think that this sort of amendment to the proposal would weaken it rather than strengthen it. But as you said, I may have to read the 9,000 words of your paper in order to answer competently. Sean Healy's questions. Yes, and so and that's again related to the VAT. The impact of this proposal in terms of the redistribution of income in the country may not be at all, despite the fact that it's VAT, may not be a sort of a more regressive redistribution of income. For the reason you mentioned, that you'll have to readjust the whole of the system, and the rate of VAT may not increase. It's simply that countries, as soon as the bottom part of everyone's income is paid for by this euro dividend, obviously you'll be able to rely on personal income taxation while keeping the net income of the person identical. You suppress some of the exemptions at the bottom, etc. And so the whole structure could be different in each country depending on the rate of VAT and number of other components. But this is an exercise I have not done. But it shouldn't be taken for granted that it would automatically make the distribution of income more regressive, because, for the reason I just indicated. Well, the two positive impacts you mentioned, yes, perhaps, but of course, if a basic income is already hard to introduce within a country, politically, well, it will be even more difficult if you don't have specific arguments of this sort on a higher scale. And so then, because the generosity of the West Germans was easier to prompt in favor of the East Germans than the generosity of the Germans or the Finns or the Dutch or the Belgians is to help the Greeks. So that the more cultural distance you have, the more cliches you have about other countries, the more difficult it is to make it politically sustainable. So, but what you said is completely right, that the advantage of this proposal compared to all the other things we could imagine is that really it's a floor. And so above that you can top it up in all sorts of ways, including of course through a national basic income. Finally, the Mike from Paderborn question, yes, why not a currency unit? Well, you know, across the Atlantic, indeed, across the world. In fact, there's a nice quote from John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy that says that, in fact, the pride with which each of the country wants to assert its own currency is just a remnant of barbarism that some civilized countries have wanted to retain. So one day maybe it would make sense to have a single currency, but of course we can't have a currency at a higher level without creating these conditions. These conditions, and Jan Otto's question, I'm in favor of introducing this at the level of the European Union, because then we would do the right thing before other people join. That is, what was the stupidity in the euro is to have the euro before having the buffering mechanism behind it. So you need to create the buffering mechanism at the level of the entire European Union, or with potential extensions, and that will then create the basis within which then all the advantages of the currency can be enjoyed. In fact, James Mead, our great predecessor in Bien, and one of the great advocates of basic income, in this sort of very pioneering text, 1957, I recommend it in the Economic Journal, said, well, eventually we should go for the sort of European government that will make a European currency feasible. But the conditions are not right for that, and so we should, that was just at the time of the Treaty of Rome, 57, but we shouldn't forego all the advantages of a single market, towards which we should move, until, while waiting for the conditions for a single currency to be viable. So we must move forward with a single market, but not with a single currency. That was his advice. But then if we create these conditions, particularly the redistributive conditions, other conditions need to be fulfilled, like a banking union, etc. But this is a crucial function. Then the other countries can join too. And this, in my view, is indeed, it's important for us Europeans, but also because if we want a world that's sustainable and that is minimally just, this is the sort of institutions we need.
Okay, so we're going to close the workshop. It's time now, so thank you very much to all the panelists. I thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. Thank you.